Well, thank you very much, Jackie, for that extremely warm introduction. And I'm very glad that you've been so willing to take over the leadership of the school at this time. And I know you've had a very significant impact as interim director, but also I think many people really appreciated what you've been doing for the school, and I want to congratulate you on that. Also, thank you, Catherine, for inviting me. In fact, this is the first time I get to speak to the Alberta Enterprise Group. I've always seen the name, and I get lots of notifications of various things that are happening, and it's nice to actually be able to participate in an event of the sustained organization. I was going to start with a joke, but I want to try to keep my remarks short enough for the questions, so I'm going to dispense with the joke. And go right into kind of the heart of what I want to talk about. And I decided that I really would like to say something about federal-provincial relations and the role of the West in Canada. And I'm going to really go through three major aspects of that. I first want to start with a reality check. Just what do we know about Western Canada, Alberta, and its contribution and its importance in Canada as a whole, and what are those issues that tend to lead to significant issues between the federal government and particularly the province of Alberta, but also some of the other provinces too, like Saskatchewan and British Columbia have their own issues as well. I then want to turn to the question of whether Canada is broken or not. Probably in this room, you've already know the answer. I'm not sure Canada is broken, but certainly I think the federal government is broken. And I'd like to say a few things about why that is the case, because I think that's the heart of the problem, I think, right now in federal-provincial relations in Canada, is the way that the federal government is currently operating. I then want to talk about the choices that are available for the West, and Alberta in particular, in terms of how things could be organized between the federal government and the province. And then I'd like to conclude with, I think, some very specific ideas that would probably improve the position and the opportunities for Alberta, which is still the most entrepreneurial economy in Canada, and the one that actually has been generating the most growth of any other province in Canada as well. And to begin, let me start with the reality check. And there's really 3 points that I want to make. The first is that Western Canada, if you go back 150 years ago, was just even though it was a vast land, it had a small population. And it really did not have that many people living in it. It was like 5% of Canada's population overall, and probably at that time people weren't measuring GDP by area, but I'm sure its economic growth or its economy was fairly small too. But today, Western Canada is now the second largest region in Canada. It's bigger than Quebec. This is something that people have not appreciated. When Pierre Elliott Trudeau was elected in 1968, Quebec was the second largest province, both in terms of GDP and population. But today that's no longer true. The West is the second largest and catching up to Ontario in terms of size. So I put a few numbers together just to kind of give you something that kind of illustrates how big Western Canada is. In terms of the share of population, the Western region, the 4 provinces, and I threw in the 3 territories, but they're really small, so they don't make that much of a difference. But it's 32% of Canada's population is now Western Canada. If you go back 50 years, it was more like 21, 22%. So that's a huge amount of growth that we've seen in the population. Ontario is 39%. So Western Canada is not that much smaller than Ontario anymore, which is a huge change from 150 years ago, obviously. Quebec today has 22% of Canada's population. At one time they had 28, 50 years ago, but they have dropped, and they're becoming less important as a share of population. Of course, that has important implications. And just to let you know, Alberta has 12% of Canada's population. Share of GDP, Canada has, the West has 36% of Canada's GDP. So we actually have a bigger share of GDP than we do population. And that's because we have higher per capita GDP, especially Alberta and BC. They have the highest GDP per capita of any province in Canada today. Ontario's at 38%. So in terms of the size of the economy, we're almost at Ontario. 36 versus 38%. That's not a very big difference. And probably in 10 years' time, that might be, they may be equal size in terms of economic power. And Quebec is at 20%. Even though they have a bigger share of they have 22% of the population, they have lower per capita incomes, and so they're at 20% of Canada's GDP. Alberta, by the way, punches above its weight when it comes to GDP. It's 15% of Canada's GDP is in Alberta today. This is latest numbers. And we also know that Alberta is a huge contributor to the rest of the country. When you look at the way that people have measured it, Robert Menzel at the School of Public Policy is well known for this work. Alberta, through the federal budget, in terms of paying taxes relative to taxes to the federal government relative to spending by the federal government in Alberta, Alberta is a net contributor to the rest of the country. $20 billion, $5,000 per person is contributed to the rest of Canada, more than any other province. Ontario doesn't even come close to that number. I think they're around 1,400 or something like that. And so Alberta, because of its wealth, it is a major contributor to the rest of the country. Interestingly, so is British Columbia today. And so is Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan used to be a net recipient many years ago, but Saskatchewan has been booming, and they are a net contributor to the rest of the country as well. So when you look at the West, it's only Manitoba, by the way, that's a net recipient in terms of spending power of the federal government relative to the taxes that are paid to the federal government. And so that just gives you a sense of huge growth that's happened in the West, and a great amount of economic power, and the contribution that, as a rich part of the country and a growing part of the country, is making to the rest of Canada. It's an astounding change that's happened, especially when you compare what Canada was like 100 years ago. Well, that's the first point. So we're a huge economic power now in this country in terms of the West, and of course Alberta certainly punches well above its weight. It's still the richest province in the country as well. Now, the second reality is that even though we have this tremendous economic power, we don't have political power. Politics in Canada at the national level has been largely determined by coalitions that have been between Ontario and Quebec, voting coalitions. The industrial structure of Quebec and Ontario is closer to each other in terms of manufacturing than what you find in Western Canada. But as a result, there has been a feeling of lack of say in national decision-making because the West really, despite its size and its economic power, doesn't have the political power to go along with it. And there is an exception to that. And we saw that with Stephen Harper when he became Prime Minister. He was able to create a coalition between Southern Ontario, specifically the GTA area around Toronto, the 905 region it's always called, and Western Canada. And he didn't win that many seats in Quebec. And it was the first time that Quebec was left out. And in a way, that's not surprising that kind of coalition can occur, because Quebec is losing its power in Canada as its population shrinks, as its population share shrinks, and its GDP as the share of Canada also shrinks. But that reality hasn't been reflected entirely in politics in Canada. And in fact, one of the significant problems, I think, in Canada Goes right back to 1867, where John A. Macdonald wanted to keep a unitary government operating with kind of federal features, but he rejected the kind of bicameral government that you would find in the United States and that later Australia developed, where you have one of the bodies that would have equal representation from each of the states, and in the case of Canada, from each of the provinces. At that time, there were 4 provinces, of course, and then later on, each PEI joined in Manitoba, etc. But he rejected that model, and we never was able to get a proper institutional framework at the federal level where you have real significant regional power being reflected in decision-making at the federal level. The view was that the cabinet would have representation from different parts of Canada, and it would be through the cabinet that you would get some say from each of the parts of Canada in national decision-making. But the role of the cabinet has changed today. We've seen a significant centralization of power within the federal government at the Prime Minister's office level. It was true of Stephen Harper's time. It was true even earlier on, starting with Pierre Elliott Trudeau, but it's been even more so today than ever before. And so if you're not getting any regional representation coming through the cabinet, where the cabinet doesn't really have that much power anymore, it's only done through the PMO, it's not surprising that the federal government, when it comes to handling federal-provincial relations, is broken. And it's broken because of the way that national institutions now operate in Canada. You don't get the same problem in Australia, and you don't get the same problem in the United States, because you have a bicameral government where one part of that government, the Senate in the case of the United States and in Australia, has equal representation from each of the provinces or the states, and therefore much more regional say in government as a result. We don't have any of that in Canada. And frankly, it was a mistake that was made in 1867. And we're living the consequences of that today. So that's a second part of my reality check. The third one is that the West is largely a resource-based economy. We know that Alberta is the energy power of Canada and an energy power of the world. It also has a strong agricultural sector. It has a forestry sector, etc. Saskatchewan and Manitoba, strong agricultural sector. Saskatchewan has potash. It's the major producer of potash in the world, has about 50% share of potash production worldwide. Mining has been important in Manitoba, as well as a certain extent in Saskatchewan. Of course, Saskatchewan also has some oil and gas. And of course, British Columbia, forestry has been a major industry for the province, but it also has natural gas, and also mining has been very significant as well, particularly copper mining. And then, and we know that the world is changing. And the reality is we are going to have energy transition, or transformation, I think is a better word. It's a reality that we're just going to have to live with, because it's going to happen over the century. How quick it happens and how it happens, of course, we don't have any idea exactly what that's going to be. But we do know it's going to take time. Anytime you make major changes in technology, it's not something you do overnight. But it's going to be a change that I think actually can give Alberta opportunities, because when it comes to energy, Alberta really is the place to be in Canada when it comes to the energy industry and the expertise that is sitting here as a result. So that's a reality that one has to understand. Food is also going to be a major issue down the road, and being able to feed vast populations in the world. And again, we have a very successful agricultural sector, as well as a very successful fertilizer sector in Western Canada. That demand is not going to go away for many years down the road. Mining, we know, is going to be a major industry as part of the new energy transition. Actually, Alberta has paid very little attention to mining in its policies over the years. In fact, It's basically been coal mining and not very much. But there are, again, opportunities that may come down the road as well. And then the other major change that's happening in the world in terms of that will cause a significant change in the way that businesses are going to operate is the advanced technologies that are impacting already many businesses. The opportunities to use artificial intelligence, the digitization, all these things are rapidly changing business practices, whether it's in manufacturing, the resource sector, whatever sector it is, it's happening now. And of course, for the West, which has got this dynamic business sector, this is a great opportunity for the West to even grow further as it develops these new technologies. So those are the three reality checks. The West is a very strong economic power now in Canada, but it has weak political power. And the world is changing. It's rapidly changing. And it's going to need to have, and people are going to have to adapt to these changes. And that's going to be the case even for resource-based economies like Canada. But resources are going to be a very significant opportunity to provide the economic strength that the world needs in the future. We're going to need those resources, and Western Canada is a home to a lot of it. Now, let me get to the second point. Is Canada broken? Well, as I said, I think the federal government is broken. And there's several things that are going on which I think are critical problems. Regulation is a huge issue, no question about it. Bill C-69 has been a total disaster. Can you think of anything that's been built under Bill C-69? Yesterday I had breakfast with one of the very senior executives who's no longer, he just retired from Teck. Of course, the major mining company in Canada, no longer looking at investments in Canada. They're going abroad. And why? Because of regulations. In fact, as he reminded me, there has not been one single major mining development in Canada for the past decade. Not one. So we're not just talking about Alberta. We're talking about the whole country. And as you know, Bill C-69, which has been fondly called by Jason Kenney as the No Pipelines Bill, has been a block on the development of energy as well. And the federal government put out a new critical minerals strategy, which I read in detail, and they went blah, blah, blah about improving regulation and permitting and speeding, having speed, and they're going to create this panel, and they're going to have these consultants getting hired, and et cetera, et cetera. But did they have one single idea in that document about how they're going to do it? No, just all talk. And that's what we're getting right now, a lot of talk coming out of Ottawa. Indigenous relations. I can't think of a worse thing that we have been so slow on in Canada. I remember Pierre Elliott Trudeau used to talk about getting rid of the Indian Act. Never happened. And the governance and what's been done in terms of governance of the Indigenous First Nations in this country, it should have changed many years ago in the way that we've done things, giving them more independence, giving them an opportunity to build their own leadership. In fact, today it's really all about Indigenous leadership. And actually, Alberta has gone farther ahead. In fact, I was just in a session yesterday, has gone further ahead than any other province in terms of Indigenous relations. But one of the key points that I heard was the importance of understanding Indigenous leadership now as part of being a part of the development of the resource sector. And I think there are great opportunities that we are going to see. We're already starting to see this happen, where Indigenous participation in resource development projects is going to actually allow for the growth of these things in a better way. But certainly we have a lot to do in terms of improving governance in this area, which I think is to get the heavy hand of the federal government out of the First Nations. The third point is taxation, which some of you, I'm sure, understand. But Canada now has one of the highest top marginal tax rates in the world, and certainly in the OECD countries. Yes, not as high as Sweden, but it is still on the high side. 54, I think the average is around 53%, but it also hits at a very low income level relatively, and that's what people forget. But when you look at personal taxes shared of GDP, Canada has got one of the highest ratios of all the OECD countries. Corporate tax, we did make some significant improvements in corporate tax from year 2000 to 2012, but we've stalled. Other countries are still moving ahead, improving their corporate tax system. So we're kind of in the middle of the pack, but we're getting near the top of the middle of the pack. And we don't have an outstanding corporate tax system. In fact, if anything, it has some very significant issues involved where there's too many specific incentives, tax on growth of small businesses that if they try to get larger, they end up getting into the morass of the taxes that large businesses pay, plus all the regulations that apply to the industry. Federal government itself, since 2015, the number of employees at the federal level have increased by over 30%. Actually, during Harper's time, I was quite surprised looking at the numbers. The actual federal civil service actually shrank during that period. I didn't realize it until I was looking at the numbers. But 30%. If you look at the average hourly wage, including benefits at the federal level, $75 per hour. $130,000 average salary per year. Average. It's just gone out of whack. And the productivity, has it improved in the federal government? You can't get you can't get your old age security. You can't get your passport done in a reasonable time. It's just one item after another. Kim and I have had experience of an organization trying to get its charitable receipt. A year and a half to try to get a charitable number. And private foundations, people wanting to create private foundations, you got to wait over a year now to get a number. The federal government's federal service is broken because it's doing way too many things, and people are not, frankly, working hard enough if they're going to stay at home all the time and not be spending as much time as they should. And then the carbon plan at the federal level. If you want to look at something that's really broken, and I don't think we've said this enough in this country, but the federal plan is broken. 2030, the targets are totally unrealistic. They have no clue how they're going to get to them. If you go through all the sectors they identified, electricity and oil and gas and construction or buildings and et cetera, they have all these 6 to 7 different categories. The auto sector as well. Everyone is telling the federal government they cannot make their targets, except for agriculture. They only have a target of a 3% reduction in emissions, so it's not too bad. But everyone else at 30%, 40% reduction, it's not doable. And yet nobody is saying anything enough about this. It is broken, the plan. It's not going to happen, and no one realizes it yet. And so I think and as a result, it's creating a huge amount of tension between the federal and the provincial governments as a result. So this really kind of gets me to the final point I want to say, and that is, what are the options for Western Canada and Alberta, particularly with respect to this broken system we now have in federal-provincial relations in Canada? Well, obviously, they're kind of like 3 different approaches, and Tom Flanagan and Ted Morton and I discussed it in our book on Alberta a few years ago, or a couple of years ago. One of them is to try to get more power in Ottawa by changing the institutions, as I've mentioned. For example, like in Australia, or another option would be Germany, where the provinces actually have, there's a second, in Germany there's a second body, and the body is made up of provincial delegates, or state level, landers in Germany. And in other words, the lower governments appoint the people that go to the second body. So this way they have actually a real body that represents their regional interests. Difficulty is trying to change our constitution. And the big losers of any change like that will be the Atlantic provinces, because right now they get 10 seats each in the Senate, and they have such a small population. They only have maybe 2 million people living in the Atlantic today, which is roughly 5% of Canada's population, but then they get 40% of the seats, well, except for PEI. They get 34, so they get about a third of the seats in the Senate, which really doesn't make much sense. But it's very hard to make changes as a result. The second, of course, is separation. And maybe if things get frustrated enough, people will start more look at that more seriously. But there are different interests across the West. Manitoba, I think, would never want to separate. In fact, they're a recipient of money from the federal government and net recipient, and so it's unlikely they would want to separate. But the other thing is that we all have families that are across this country, and we have attachments across this country. Separation is not that easy when you have labor mobility in a federation and people move between jurisdictions. And here's my case. I go between Alberta and Ontario all the time. My kids, my grandkids are all in Ontario. And so it makes it very hard for, I think, people to contemplate separation for that reason. So the third option is provincial autonomy. And I think that's where there's a lot of potential interest, not just by Alberta, and Quebec, which has always pushed for provincial autonomy, but also some of the other provinces may have that interest, but they may have interests in different things that would be attached to that. So let me just finish with 4 or 5 things that I think Alberta should consider in terms of in terms of autonomy. First of all, I think we should ask ourselves, what's the point of more provincial autonomy? Well, it's your ability to control your own life and have your own, and create your own opportunities. And in particular, given the economic power of this province, as well as the rest, it's also more control of your economic powers as well, your ability to control your economy. And so I think there's also quite something, as I mentioned earlier on, about Alberta's unique entrepreneurial culture, and it's very true. I mean, people always used to say that, but it wasn't until during the pandemic when I chaired the Alberta's Economic Recovery Council and I met with the various groups, and I compared that to meetings I had in Ontario, and I'll tell you, Alberta is very different. The business community thinks very differently. The groups didn't talk about, we need this handout from the Alberta government, or we need this grant, or we need this. Instead, they were talking about, can we get a change in regulations that can allow us to do this? In other words, get the obstacles out of the way for growth rather than giving us a bunch of subsidies and everything else. And in fact, one of the people on the panels came from Ontario and said, we wouldn't have these kind of conversations in Ontario in the business community, because it's always, what can the government do for us next in terms of more money? And here in Alberta, that's not the way of thinking. Here in Alberta, everybody understands that growth comes from great ideas and people having the opportunity to develop them and having the right macro environment for that to happen. And that's the entrepreneurial society that we have in Alberta. So I think a lot of the things that we should do are trying to foster that. I would certainly consider a personal tax collection agreement where we get out of the personal tax collection agreement with the federal government, mainly to start being able to develop a personal tax system that we would have more ability in changing not just rates, but also the base in a way that could help grow the economy better. Now, Alberta already collects its own corporate income tax, and frankly, it doesn't use its corporate tax power very much. In fact, they keep following the federal base all the time. And I think it's about time that Alberta start thinking of that corporate tax and levering that corporate tax for growing the economy. A big one, which I think is important, is moving from cash transfers from the federal government to personal tax transfer points, transferring personal tax points. What people don't realize, the top federal rate in Quebec is not 33%. It's about 28.5%. Why? Because Quebec has had a bigger amount of personal tax transfers going back to the 1960s that has given the province the ability to have a bigger share of the personal tax system. Now, in Quebec, they actually like a very progressive tax system, so they tended to have top rates that were even higher than the federal, than other provinces. But in Alberta, we tend to like to encourage skilled labor. And so if we had a bigger share of the personal tax, by taking fewer cash transfers from the province, but taking more personal tax points, so we have a bigger share of that personal tax, if we decide to have it to be a little bit less progressive than the rest of the country, we can end up lowering our top rates as well. And so there's a great opportunity if we think more along these lines in terms of trying to get provincial autonomy. Police force, you know, I was never that excited about having an independent police force, but I just read a book written on policing in Canada, and it was very interesting. It was a U of T professor, Ken Roach, who wrote the book, and he argued that actually more provinces should move away from just using the RCMP and developing their own police force. And he actually talked about Alberta as being a good case of doing that. New Brunswick already does that, Quebec does that, and so does Ontario. And the reason is that you can have more sensitivity with respect to the people that need to have support in what they do. You know, for example, the development of, in some of these police forces, they've developed significant Indigenous police forces to work with Indigenous populations and being more supportive of them. In Alberta, we get caught up in the expense. We say, well, the federal government's paying for some of the costs of the RCMP. So that's, you know, it could be expensive having our own police force. But actually what Ken Roach argued is that Alberta should be telling the federal government to give them to give them money back that is being paid. Besides, we're paying for most of the federal, you know, big portion of the federal budget anyway. Then finally, I think we need to have the Alberta pension plan. I won't go into all the details now, but I know the numbers, and Alberta would have a tremendous amount of money going to it if it had its own Alberta pension plan, because in the past our contributions have been a lot more relative to the benefits that have been paid out. And the way that the agreement goes that was developed in creating the Canada Pension Plan, if a province leaves the plan, you look at all the past contributions and all the past benefits paid out, and the province actually is entitled to get that back coming out of the Canada Pension Plan. It's a huge amount of money, by the way, but it would give Alberta a very significant opportunity to lower payroll taxes. But by the way, you still have to keep the same benefits if you leave, the same benefits as the Canada Pension Plan. In fact, if you look at Quebec, their benefits are no different than the Canada Pension Plan. And so the only difference is the contribution rate. But if we actually had an Alberta pension plan, that would give us more financial power to you know, and a larger financial community that could help accelerate growth in this province. And then finally on oil and gas, no matter what we have to do, we need to have a new relationship with the federal government on oil and gas. There will be federal role in oil and gas regulation because they have power over environment and they have international treaty power making. But it doesn't mean that you can't have a proper agreement, just as we've done with tax collection agreements and other things in this country, infrastructure and other agreements. And the problem right now is the federal government has been unilateral in its decision making. And I think the carbon tax, minimum carbon tax or cap and trade system, personally I think was a mistake because it forces onto provinces something that some provinces didn't want to follow along. What should have happened is the federal government and the provinces agree on some sort of targets and let each province decide how they're going to get to the target. Kind of like the Paris Agreement, which is really what is being done now. That would be a far better approach than simply the federal government using unilateralism and forcing down the throats of the provinces a policy that they're not happy with. And the fact that you had the carbon tax case that went up to the Supreme Court had almost every province on one side of that, and a new one that's going up on Bill C-69, where all the provinces have signed up on it, tells you there's an extreme unhappiness with federal unilateralism today. And we need to sort this out, because we're going to be hurting ourselves as a country if we don't develop our natural resources, which is a tremendous strength to this country from over the years. So I'm going to stop there. I probably went far too long, Catherine. But I really have given a lot of thought to these issues, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions and if you think I'm wrong in any points, I'll be very happy to hear that as well. Thanks very much.
If you have a question, if you would stand up and state your name and the organization you're representing, and then ask your question.
I'll ask one.
So,
Jack, you didn't specifically mention although I think you hinted about it, the just transition stuff that's come out. I've read the stuff that's available, at least any on summary documents, the so-called memo from the federal government. And my 2 cents on it is that it could almost be written by a kindergarten person. I mean, it was that bad, from my perspective. Your thoughts on that?
well, I have written a few things on just transition. If you notice, the federal government has now dropped the term just transition. It's now become the sustainable jobs, something like that. Yeah, anyway, because it actually, the origin of it, which, by the way, a number of things have been written wrong, but the origin actually goes back to the 1970s. It was something that the unions brought up in the United States because of EPA actions, the Environmental Protection Agency, that was going to toughen up a bunch of environmental rules and cause a lot of job losses. And so the union said, well, we need a just transition where we're going to get some other jobs available to us and getting support and things like that. And that's actually where the whole concept started, interestingly. And then it got adopted in the Paris 2015 discussion. And so the federal government started pushing around this just transition as well. I read that their just transition plan. It's kind of like the critical minerals plan. There's nothing there. It's just a bunch of people talking and probably a bunch of consultants getting hired. That's going to be the just transition plan. It's having more consultants. And, as some of you probably read my article in Hannah, Alberta. What did the federal government, they funded an employment center, like as if that was needed. And, more consultants that would work in the thing. It didn't do anything for the people that lost jobs. But I think what's really a concern to me about oil and gas, there are tremendous opportunities for the province. I sit on the board of Imperial, and the pathways, carbon capture, utilization, storage, hydrogen, low carbon fuel. There's great opportunities there, and that's where the world's going. We just got to understand that. But it doesn't, and we should be in that game, and we should be developing investments and everything else. But the way that the federal government is handling this right now, I think created two major problems. Number one, they're discouraging people from going into oil and gas, where actually we need more people. It's the exact opposite. We should be talking about the opportunities now that are in the industry, not that it's going to be a dying industry. And in fact, I think that's actually going to be one of the key things that we should be talking about. And so I think the whole discussion has been very wrong and very unhelpful. Secondly, I think that we also have to remember Alberta has benefited hugely from our oil and gas sector, no question about it. So one of the things I like doing is I like looking up the productivity and the wages across sectors in the economy. And I looked at, and this is why I knew the public administration and federal employees, what they get. But if you look at what is the industry right now that pays the highest hourly wage and benefits of any industry in Canada, it's oil, it's non-conventional oil and gas production, extraction, that industry, which of course is the one that we have. It's the oil sands, etc. Average wage, hourly wage, $95 an hour, including benefits. That translates into $180,000 income per year. So I asked some people in the oil patch, I said, what do you think is your average wage that you pay in the oil sands? And I said, my calculations around 100, based on Stat Canada numbers, 180,000, 185,000. And they said, well, you may be a little low. Main point, where is Wilkinson going to find jobs that are going to pay $185,000 a year? So, we can talk about all the transition we want to talk about, but I think the key is taking advantage of opportunities where people are going to get well-paid jobs, not just any old job. And so I really hate this word sustainable jobs because I don't know what it means. If we're going to have a just transition for Alberta, then we need to the federal government needs to take the shackles off the industry and to allow them to move into the opportunities that are going to be available down the road, which will probably pay very high salaries down for many people working in it. And so I think that's going to be the challenge. That should be the challenge for Canada, and it applies to other sectors as well. Yes.
Just a quick question, in terms of your studies about public policy, how something like this might unfold. So we know change happens very, very slowly, and the appetite for bigger government, at least in this country, still seems to be there. Nobody's fighting back against a lot of the things that are happening. So in terms of the change that you would recommend, it's likely to happen slower and slower and slower. But as individuals, we can all make personal choices. So the big risk, or at least one of the risks that I see, is that you have exodus of, these people who make a lot of money or who have accumulated a lot of money, moving to different jurisdictions, perhaps outside of Canada, most likely outside of Canada. I wonder if you just comment about when, at what point does the economic portion of Canada break? We know the political side of it's broken. At what point will you see that economic side break and people want to pay a little more attention?
Well, I think it's a very good point because first of all, there's a difference between policy and politics. That's one thing my friend Tom Flanagan hammers into me all the time because I tend to be a policy person. I'm not a political analyst. But, in the end, governments do what voters want, frankly. We always have to remember that. It's what voters want in the end. And, of course, when you have a crisis, then people start changing their attitudes. The Ukrainian-Russian war, the major energy crisis in Europe, which actually started before the war. It started with all their green policies. Because, again, they were rushing into a set of policies and they really didn't know what they were doing. And in the end, they got themselves completely dependent on Russia because they needed the natural gas. But they also had problems with, like Germany had all its wind and solar up in the north, and they didn't have enough energy. They were buying power from Poland and giving power to Poland so that they could get Polish energy into southern Germany. I mean, it was the most screwy type of arrangement that was going on. So, what's happened now is that people realize that, we can't forget that the important thing about energy is also affordability and its impact on industries and growth and reliability. That's the other very important aspect. And so we've had to change, and we have to keep hammering that point. Unfortunately, the more radical environmentalists keep saying, well, this means that we should even move faster on it. But they have no plan of how you're going to move faster. They just talk about it. And so I think we have to keep doing that. Your point about brain drain, we haven't had brain drain since the 1990s. But one of the reasons we started seeing personal tax cuts in 2000 at the federal level, and then in the provinces here, Alberta adopted the flat tax, was because of the 1990s, when we started seeing this brain drain down to the United States. Our per capita incomes are dropping below the U.S., partly because of the exchange rate. And if people don't feel they have opportunities here in Canada, they are going to leave. It hasn't been happening yet. But we do see these labor shortages. And my view is that the way that this rapid aging of population, it's not just happening in Canada, right across the whole all high-income countries. Very fast, rapid aging over between now and 2035. There's going to be continuing labor shortages, and immigration is going to be a lot tougher, especially skilled immigrants, because everyone's going to be looking for skilled immigrants around the world. So real key is to get business investment going in this country. And I think the federal government is starting to get that, but their answer is industrial subsidy, industrial policies. We're going to pick the winners. Some are winners, some we don't care about, which my view is the wrong approach. So I think what we need is, parties, an alternative party that talks about a different approach to getting growth, as opposed to picking winners and losers, which I always like to remind people governments are not very good at picking winners and losers, but losers are very good at picking governments. Yes, sir.
I really feel privileged we are to have you in our presence here. I would like to ask, I'm personally concerned about not least the NDP's presence in Edmonton and your domination there. If you could give the Daniel Smith team advice on what they would do to try to win Calgary for certain strategy, and if I'm not overimposing, could you also say what you would give the Polyev Conservatives as strategy to challenge Trudeau for success? Thank you.
Okay. Tough question. I was born and raised in Edmonton, and actually, to be honest with you, I'm surprised how much it's shifted to the NDP over the past number of years. And we're in the last election, the NDP won 19 out of 20 seats in Edmonton. And in 2015, I guess they won a similar number as well. It's one of those things that political party has to work on in terms of developing, support, because I know not everybody is happy in Edmonton. My brother is there, and I talk to family and things like that. They're not happy with downtown Edmonton. They see that it has become very seedy, and crime is a problem. And so it's just like other parts of the world, in North America particularly. You have to focus on things that people care about, and those are things like safety, having your garbage picked up, the little things, good productivity, and so I think that's the sort of thing that has to happen. But I also think a government on the right that keeps reminding people about the importance of business and growth is very important. Is very important because people want new opportunities, and so a government that displays that interest in developing new opportunities, I think, is important. I've met people like Edmonton Global and things like that. They're talking about technologies, developing new businesses, new opportunities, and so there are people in Edmonton that are gravitate to that. And I think I'm not an expert by any means on this, but I think that I think those are the key is to talk about the issues that people care about. Poilievre's his success so far is that he really focuses on the things that people are worried about. Inflation, for example, and housing costs, items like that. And he stays very focused on it. He doesn't get sidetracked onto other topics. We'll see how he does, in the federal election, and campaigns matter. But he has been really focused on that, and when he does that, that's where his success comes in. But I think his biggest challenge is to try to get that GTA area back, the 905 region around Toronto, which is a heavily immigrant population. Many of them came under Liberal governments, so they, my own grandparents, my grandfather, he voted Liberal only because he came to Canada under the Liberals. But Harper had real success, with the 905 region, because he understood that a lot of the immigrants that come to Canada are looking for the same thing that many Canadians want. They want to have good education, which is another big issue, I think, here in Alberta, but good education, They want, you know, they want to be able to work, have their kids working, have opportunities, etc. And I think there should be a complete focus on those sorts of things, even at the federal level, because I think people are now getting worried about Canada's position relative to the rest of the world.
If you were door knocking for the UCP campaign, and we know there's issues of wage, Jason Kenney wasn't as polite as he could be, even though I was volunteer for him. And there's other issues within all these parties. But if someone's undecided, sir, on whether it be NDP or UCP, is there a take line or a remark you could make to cut through all the shaft and say why we want Danielle Smith? Should we push the economy as the best? Or could you give some advice sincerely on what you would say to those people that aren't really wanting to open their door, or they're not sure of, they may like UCP but they don't like Danielle Smith?
Right.
Is there a way to cut through that, sir? As you know, we only have one kick at the can at the door. Is there a dynamic statement you could offer?
Right. You're really going above my pay grade right now, because I'm not. That's where a pollster and public relations people really have expertise about, and that's a communications thing about, what is the sort of thing that has an appeal. All I'm saying is that focus is really important in policy, in politics, and picking the right theme. As far as the NDP, I know that their big challenge is the fact that 2015 and 2019 was not a very good economy in that period, and people understand that, and I think that's why they're going to have trouble. They would not, like UCP in 2019 won 23 out of 26 seats in Calgary, and they may not get that this time, but they have bedrock support in especially southern Calgary. But I think the key is going to be talking about what people really care about the most. And I think when it comes to the NDP, I can see a lot of pictures of Notley with Trudeau during the campaign. But that's a negative thing, not a positive.
Thank you.
Jack, I wonder if you
Yeah,
could comment about the healthcare system in Canada. What kind of
Yeah, I should mention there's been a lot of misinformation on the COVID panel, and even if you read what's in the press, you think it's actually looking at what happened 3 years ago and what lessons to be learned. That's not what the COVID panel is doing. It's actually looking at legislation and what legislation needs to change. Do you know there's some legislation that comes from 100 years ago that hasn't been revised? And there's issues in terms of, about how do you handle emergencies, what kind of government bodies you should have, and things like that. This is actually a very different type of exercise than trying to rehash what happened 3 years ago, because that's not what our interest is going to be. But to get to your question, Owen, healthcare is, there's a lot of problems happening all over the world, not just in Canada. If any of you have been reading UK, they're going through exactly the same problem with the National Health Service in the United Kingdom. Shortages of nurses, shortages of doctors, emergency rooms getting filled up, things like that. It's all there, and some of it can be addressed by money, but we also know that some of it is a matter of trying to organize things better. So what we had in Canada, we've had actually during the period 2010 to, let's say, 2020, before the pandemic, governments really kept the lid on costs. The cost of healthcare did not rise that much, percentage-wise each year during that period. There was a lot of control on costs. And part of it was to try to drive more efficiencies in the system. Some of it was things like changing rules like Ontario did, and I'm not sure if Alberta did the same, but on generic versus branded drugs and their use of them and things like that. Ontario was able to reduce quite sharply its drug costs because of it was easier to substitute generic drugs for the branded drugs, as an example. Obeying the patent laws, but still there were things that could have been done. And also the generics needed more competition amongst themselves in order to encourage, to reduce costs. The need to move to more getting things out of the hospital, which is very expensive to run, more clinics and things like that. That was done a lot more in Ontario compared to here. I went through that own personal experience coming to Alberta in late 2007. I was amazed. There were a lot more things that you could do in Ontario, getting certain procedures done at clinics. You didn't pay. It was all under the OHIP at that time. But it came here to Alberta, Calgary, and you can only get things done through 2 hospitals. No other clinics, nothing else. So some of it is organization. So people have been talking about family care units. I have not. This is one thing I think the UCP and the NDP both agree on, is the need for developing more clinics. Where they disagree is that the NDP want to make them all, only public, unionized people, while the UCP would be willing to have private supply, which is what they do in Ontario and they do in Quebec and they do in BC, etc. But we need to provide more options, and that's especially important in the rural areas, because you can't build hospitals everywhere in rural areas. You have to have well-operating clinics. So that's one of the things that I think should be done. I think we need to provide more support for some non-Medicare services, things that are preventive that actually could reduce the demand on the Medicare system. Should we go to a privatized system, like not United States, but like Europe, where there's a private option entirely? In every country I know of, whether it's France, Sweden, whatever, it's a third rail here in Canada. Somehow we got stuck that all hospital and physician services should be public only, and not have any private options. But maybe there's finally going to be a break to say let's start entertaining that, maybe in certain areas and things like that. But that would be a tough one to sell in Canada. But I actually really like the idea of trying to create more options to the system. I can tell you one of the things that happened during the past decade is to save money in the system, governments cut back acute bed hospitals because they were very expensive to run. And Alberta went too far down the road. In fact, under the NDP, they went too far down the road. And it just happened by luck, maybe, that the Kenney government, before the pandemic hit, and it wasn't due to the pandemic, it was before the pandemic hit, they said, there's not enough acute beds in this province. It's way below every other province. And so they actually got more ventilators, because acute beds is more than just having a bed. You have to have the staff and the ventilators and specialized equipment that goes with it. And so they built it up from, I forget, it was 150. It went up to over 200 before the pandemic. Luckily, that was done in the fall before the pandemic hit in 2020. But that's because Alberta really went too far down the road in that way. And instead, I think the real goal should be trying to move more things out to clinics, other aspects of what the hospitals are doing. So if you need to get this is a great subject for lunch. If you need to get a colonoscopy, have clinics that could do it. It doesn't have to be in a hospital. And there's all sorts of procedures that could be done at clinics and giving more options that I think. And I see nothing wrong with private supply, because basically every doctor's private supply right now, the way they operate. It's their own office. They take all their own risks and everything else. So, Auntie?
When I was in university, one of the biggest debates was whether it's give more voice to different regions of Canada. And what I heard, if I heard you right, you're saying that the power now is concentrated in PMO, Prime Minister Office, as opposed to the House of Commons now in Cabinet. Is something changing there? Is it ideological shift in Canada, where people, parties don't want to talk to each other or listen to each other's viewpoints, and they become pretty sure of what they know and what they want to continue?
It's a good question. Probably if you ever want to get somebody who'd be really good on this subject, Catherine, would be Don Savoie from New Brunswick, who's got a new book out on this, which I read recently, and he talks at great length. Now, what's happened? Why has there been this kind of concentration? And by the way, his book compares France, United States, Canada, and one other country. There were four, oh, British, UK. And the centralization of power is happening everywhere within government, into the Prime Minister's office or into the President's office. But the United States, of course, has all these checks and balances, and it's constitutional, so you can't get away from it. A president can't acquire this much power, although they've been trying to do it administratively through the system. But in the UK and Canada, of course, Prime Minister is going to have a huge amount of power. And some of the reasons may be related to social media and the fact that, it's harder to control the message and harder to control things, and so therefore there's a desire to keep more control at the top in order to control the message, control what's being communicated to the public, and rather than allowing debate and giving flexibility to departments to make decisions and things like that. So that's one reason I would say for it, but there may be other factors that are playing a role. But certainly, we've seen this increased concentration of power in the Prime Minister's office, not just in Canada but elsewhere. But in Canada, it's deadly because we don't have any. Unlike the United States, we've had no checks and balances against the Prime Minister's office. There's none whatsoever. And when it comes to regional decision making, the only way that we now protect the interests of the provinces is through the provincial leaders and the provincial governments themselves. They're the only ones that actually express the voice of a province at the national level. And that's why provincial autonomy, Canada is actually one of the more decentralized federations in the world. And I think we're going to move to more decentralization because we have such a weak federal institutions that allows for regional voices to be heard.
What was the name of the professor?
Sorry?
The gentleman who wrote the book.
Don Savoy, Savois, and it's called Government. Although it's got a longer, it's one of those things, but the main title is Government. There was a question, I think, in the back. Yeah.
Rick Shannon,
Oh, Rick, yeah.
you mentioned that the government will do what the voters want them to do. And in
Well, they have to respond, otherwise they lose power.
in the 2019 election, there was a survey 2 weeks before the election that said, what do you want from the government? And overwhelmingly, the answer was more action on climate. More action on climate, okay? You look at that in the face of what's happened in Ontario, notwithstanding your provincial Liberals, which just had a horrible impact on the economy there. How can we ever get out of this spiral that we're in, where we as the entrepreneurial province are up against people who, according to the Financial Post today, 42% want socialism.
Yeah.
How are we ever going to get beyond that? This goes back to a few years ago when I was active in this. I no longer am, and I probably shouldn't even be speaking. I was for separation. The Constitution in Canada is FUBAR. It doesn't work. The examples of the Maritimes, examples of Quebec. It doesn't work. It can't work. So how are we ever going to get beyond it? Given that this gentleman says this all takes a long time. It's going to take a hell of a lot longer than I have.
Oh, I agree that it's going to take a long time. The climate change issue is one thing. By the way, I always have trouble with polls, but anyway, there's lots of polls done, and some of them are accurate, some of them aren't. And election polls are good examples. There's an agreement, I think, by a broad part of the population. I think you'll even find people here in Alberta that that there is an issue to be dealt with, and and we should try and deal with it. You do have the more radical people that say we have a catastrophe and we're going to all die by 2030 if we don't do that. I mean, we've had so many of these doom and gloom people over the years. Remember the growth people that said population growth, we're all going to starve to death because we have too many people and all this sort of thing. Anyway, none of that ever came true. And so I think that's going to also happen with climate change. None of this is ever going to get true. But what I do think, though, is that right now people do not understand the consequences right now of various climate policies and the speed. After sitting on boards, to adopt new technologies takes a long time. You first of all have to figure out if they're technically feasible, and then you also have to figure out whether it's commercial. And that's the problem in the climate change thing. We're talking about hydrogen, and we're talking about carbon capture and sequestration, and et cetera. And somehow we're going to adopt a whole bunch of things by 2030 or 2035. I mean, it's just impossible. I'll never forget, I had a conversation with, and I won't say who it was, but he was a very senior advisor to the Wind government. And he came from the private sector. And I remember talking to him in, I think it was running the school. It was around 2012. And he was telling me that we will be having self-driving cars, and electric cars will be they'll be totally adopted by 2030. In other words, everybody will be an electric car, and there'll be self-driving cars by then. And I said, I don't know what you're smoking. That you think in 10 years, or I think it was like 15 years, that somehow all this is going to happen. Well, you said you should talk to the auto industry. Yeah, right. Anyway, even electric cars, these goals of like 2026, we're going to have so many people in electric cars driving. It's just not going to happen. In fact, there's an article this morning in the Wall Street Journal that all the car companies are saying that we're not going to be able to do this. The public is not ready, and we don't have the technology ready either. And as we know, it takes time for it to do anything. So I think when you get into serious trouble, as Europe did, then people start rethinking the model. And unfortunately, I think we have to go through that process. But it's going to take time. Okay.
I'll indulge with the second question. So
I always like your questions.
I always have trouble understanding the Bank of Canada's inflation readings with all the exclusions. And so the latest one, if I understand it correctly, is about 6.3% or whatever the hell the number was. But there's exclusions for mortgage payments, and exclusion for food, and exclusions for, the list goes on. So I guess it seems to me, just based upon anecdotal evidence and watching some of my colleagues and employees and how they're struggling with cost of living, that even if it is really 6.3%, that's still, the news is not all great. So I wouldn't mind your comments on that. Like, is there a way to calculate real inflation, or is there such a thing?
Any of you have taken economics and might remember in graduate school learning about L'Esper's and Pascal price indices. But anyway, first of all, what often gets reported as a headline price inflation is the consumer price index. So that includes everything, includes food, et cetera, et cetera. Now, there is when it comes to housing, the Statistics Canada tries to measure the service costs for housing. So they're not looking at the asset price changes, they're looking at things like mortgage costs, rental costs, and things like that. And so it's a combined number of things that go into it. And so sometimes it doesn't seem to be going up with housing prices as much, but that's because rental costs may not be rising as quickly, interest rates may not, mortgage costs may not be rising as quickly, et cetera. They go, insurance and things like that go into housing costs. So, but it also means that when things start falling, the housing prices start falling, some of those things are going to still keep rising. So, it gets caught up the other way. When it comes to looking at inflation, the Bank of Canada will say, well, energy prices like gasoline, which is a major one, and food prices are highly volatile. They go up and down all the time. And so they there's the concept of core inflation, which is to take out volatile energy and food prices, only because it doesn't necessarily, just because they go up in one period, doesn't necessarily show a trend. And so they like to look at the core. In fact, there's another one called the Personal Consumption Expenditure Price Index that the American Federal Reserve uses. But it tends to be more kind of less volatile, more a more steady type indicator of where inflation is going. Now, in terms of today, the one thing I think Bank of Canada has changed, if you read their reports, they don't pay any attention to monetary, the money supply. It's totally anti-Friedman. And so, there was a huge increase in money supply in 2020. The federal government just went out on a spending binge over the pandemic. I've argued, and many others, that they went way too beyond what was needed. I mean, who ever heard of people making more money during a recession? I mean, it's just unbelievable. Household income went up 11% during the pandemic. It went up. It was because of all these government transfers. So if the average went up 11%, some people did better and some people did worse. I mean, it more than replaced the loss in employment income, the government transfers at that time. At the same time, the Bank of Canada accommodated it all by buying up the government bonds. So it was like quantitative easing. So you had this huge increase in money supply. And the monetarists who like following money supply will say that was the roots of the inflation that came later on. Rather than, instead the Bank of Canada said, well, we had these supply constraints and things like that. It's true, we did. In fact, I feel it's the first time we had since the 1970s, we had supply-induced inflation in the sense that we did have these supply constraints. But we also had this big push because of demand, deficit spending by the federal government that put it all together. We were bound to get more inflation, and the U.S. was even worse than us because there they seem to have no constraint when it comes to the deficits. Even the Republicans, and look at because Trump was busy with his big packages, and then Biden came in with some more big packages. And even today, if you look at Biden's subsidies for climate change, it's almost like nobody cares the fact that the federal deficit and their Social Security deficit that's coming down the road, they don't care about it because U.S. has a reserve currency, so they feel they're never going to have a credit problem. And so it makes it hard for anybody else to match them because they feel they have these deep pockets. But I think that in the case of inflation for Canada, I think we're in a very different situation now, and we have been for some time, because we have this major excess demand for labor, not enough people to work, and this aging that's going on that more and more, every month, more people are retiring. And so putting this together, I think that wage inflation is going to still be a problem. It's going to be a supply problem in a sense because we're not getting enough workers. And it's going to make it harder for inflation to drop because wage inflation will continue. And the monetary, if you look at the money supply lately, it has dropped actually. It's really shrunk. I think it's running around 6% now instead of 28, 30% as it was in 2020, or 50%. But it has shrunk. And so if you listen to some of the people who they think money supply is the only source of inflation, they say that inflation is going to really drop over the next couple of year and a half because, that the downturn in the money supply that's now happening is going to pull down inflation. I think it's a little more complicated because of supply constraints, and that's because a lot of the monetary policy models that I've worked on ever since I was a graduate student and things like that, macro models have a difficult time dealing with the supply part of the economy. And if you get a crunch like we had in the 1970s and as we saw recently, the question is how do you handle monetary policy with supply crunches like that occurring? So my view is that we're probably in for 4 to 5% inflation this year, which is still high. It's not low. And what worries me is if the Bank of Canada takes the foot off the accelerator to try to bring down inflation, we might see the 1970s getting repeated, where inflation starts dropping, Bank of Canada relaxes, inflation pops up again, and we'll have to see.
One more question. Thank you. Just one more. feel.
Just as long as it's not political.
We're often, as much as I admire the poly of conservatives, they've touted the inflation as being a great demise here. But when you look at a visual capitalist or any statistics, Canada's inflation itself isn't that outlandish compared to America and other countries. I would like to see them nail Trudeau. If you can pardon my indulgence, he reminds me of Arthur in Dudley Moore and Arthur with the checkbook reckless. The Fraser Institute says 2.1 trillion for provincial and federal. I would like to know, Dr. Mintz, could we really portray the reckless spending of Trudeau and put a number to it? On what are the federal government really spending? I would be most appreciative if you had an answer, sir. Thank you.
Okay, well, just on, I think, first of all, we have to, there's a difference between the deficit and the debt, although there's a relationship between the two. I have always argued that Canada's indebtedness is much bigger than the way the official numbers run. So if you look at, first of all, the federal government loves to tout their net debt number. And they say that, it's only 47% of GDP or whatever the number is. I'd have to look it up to what it is again. Which, by the way, is higher. It was down to 30%. But it's jumped up with the pandemic and things like that. But in arriving at net debt, this is for the country as a whole, arriving at net debt, they subtract off the net assets in CPP and QPP, which today is getting close to $900 billion. But they don't include the future liabilities associated with CPP and QPP. They only include 1 year of liability, which is the current year. So when they calculate net assets, they take all the assets that are sitting in these plans and basically ignore all the future liabilities that those assets are supposed to fund, which is our pension plans. And so they're way over exaggerating the total assets that they subtract off to get net debt. If you take $900 billion, that's almost a third of GDP. So if you add all the future liabilities of the pension plans, our net debt, instead of being right now I think it's 47% or 50%, whatever the number is, it would be more like 80 or 90%, which is a lot. So that's one problem. The other thing is that we don't take into account the unfunded liability associated with OAS and many transfers that we give the elderly, in fact through the tax system as well, like the age credit, pension credits and all that sort of stuff. And then on top of it, we don't calculate the unfunded liability associated with healthcare, which, as we know, and I used to have this quip, that the biggest expenditure in healthcare during a person's life is in their last year of life. And I always said that if people died a year before the last year of life, they would save the country a lot of money. But that is, as we know, as our population ages, healthcare expenditures are going to go up as a share of GDP. And so but we don't have a fund to fund that. And so if you start calculating that number, and you can, I do it from the IMF numbers, it adds another 30-40% on our net debt. So I get numbers well over 100% net debt. And the same thing would be for the deficit. If we started including some of these unfunded liabilities as potential expenditures down the road, you would end up creating a much bigger hole. Now, Canada has done a better job compared to a lot of other countries in terms of funding these future liabilities. Like our CPP has been, you don't find that necessarily in European countries. They don't fund their future Social Security. U.S. has had a Social Security fund, but it is going to actually go in deficit. Its assets are going to disappear by the year 2027. I mean, the Americans they're going to have a phenomenal problem soon with all their commitments that they have now, and they're spending money like drunken sailors right now. So, you know, it is an issue, but the problem is for Canada, we're not the United States. We can't go out and just simply borrow from the international market and the market saying, oh, everything looks just rosy in Canada, we'll just, you know, we'll lend them as they want. Right now we have very good credit ratings internationally. But at some point the market can turn against you. And that's when things get really tough. And that's why it's important to have growth. And so that, you know, you get more growth in the economy, you can handle these expenditures better. But we also have to have more national savings in order to make sure that we can fund all the future commitments that we wish to fund.
Is there a number of our total government, federal government expenditures?
Yeah.
Do you have any ideas about
Well, there's the official budget numbers, but you know, some of these things that I'm talking about, future liabilities, that would be if you established a fund today and try to put that into cash flow statements and things like that. No one has done that. Federal government doesn't do that.